Welcome to our summer series where I play you some of my favourite episodes that you may have missed during the year or ones that you might want to revisit. One of the biggest books of 2019 has been Leigh Sales' An Ordinary Day, and I can't tell you how many people have stopped me in the street or pulled me aside in my day-to-day life to tell me how this interview and Leigh's book has helped them. I've also had so many emails from people who work in areas around people who've experienced tragedy, like emergency and medical services. And they've all said that listening to Leigh speak in this episode and then reading her book helped them so much in their work. I hope you enjoy this episode. Take a listen.
When the worst thing that you've thought of actually happens to you, what happens next? Is your life destroyed? What happens after that?
From Mamma Mia Podcasts, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations that count. The day that turns your life upside down usually starts like any other. It's ordinary, it's normal, and then life smacks you in the head, and everything changes in an instant. As the host of the flagship news and current affairs program 7:30 and one of the most admired journalists in Australia, Leigh Sales covers these kinds of days constantly as part of her job. She interviews people who found themselves knocked sideways by tragedy, and she does it with her unique combination of compassion and natural curiosity. Leigh has spent many years interviewing people whose lives have changed suddenly and tragically. And in her new book, Any Ordinary Day, she set out to speak candidly with people who faced the unimaginable. People like Stuart Diver, who lost his first wife in a Thredbo landslide and his second wife to cancer. And Walter Mikac, who lost his wife and two little girls in the Port Arthur massacre. And if that sounds like a major downer and you're reaching to skip this episode, wait. I had to read this book because Leigh is one of my closest friends, but to be honest, I was dreading it. Despite the fact that she's a beautiful writer, and I knew that, who wants to wade through hundreds of pages of misery? Well, the only way I can describe this book is joyful, which sounds really weird, I know. The way Leigh writes, though, putting herself into the story in a way that you don't hear her do on 7:30, makes it feel warm and funny and like having a long chat with a girlfriend. I felt wiser and smarter and more resilient after reading this book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. Leigh wanted to talk to people about the worst day of their lives, yes, but she also wanted to know what happened after. How did they get through it? What did they do that helped them, and what advice would they give to others who were experiencing a similar thing? Because what she wanted to know, and what makes this book and our conversation so interesting, is what happens after that ordinary day turns extraordinary. What happens when everything that could go wrong does go wrong? And also, how have the conversations that she had with these extraordinary people shaped the way that she's dealt with her own personal tragedies? Leigh Sales, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me in.
Now, when you told me that you were writing a book, I was thrilled because you are a phenomenal writer, and that's something that a lot of people don't know about you. I think you're our generation's Helen Garner.
Oh, well, that is an unbelievable compliment, so thank you very much.
No pressure.
Yeah, that's right.
But when you told me what the book was about, I felt pretty sick because I knew that as your friend I'd have to read it. And traditionally the subject matter that you've chosen to write about is the stuff that I will actively run a mile from as someone who suffers from anxiety. I think once you have kids, your radar's often turned up to just not being able to read shocking stories of tragedy and loss.
This is the stuff that I also run from. And so for me also the choice to write a book about blind sides and life smacking you in the head was sort of shocked me because I felt fearful, like, oh my God, what am I letting myself in for here? This is the thing that I'm the most scared of. Why am I walking towards it instead of continuing to walk away from it, which is what I'd been trying to do.
Why didn't you keep walking?
Because I think I had hit a point for various reasons where I felt like I couldn't ignore the fact that your life can change suddenly for the worse. And I felt like my own show that I host on the ABC, and also just being a journalist for 25 years, I've been confronted with this reality time and time again, that people are just living their lives and they wake up and it's an ordinary day, and what they don't realise as they're buttering their toast is that this is far from an ordinary day. This is going to be the day that changes your life. And every night on 7:30, it's there'll be at least a few stories like that where something's happened like that to somebody. And so I had become the sort of person who, when I would walk my baby in a pram down the street, I would think, oh, geez, I hope some iced up pea plater doesn't jump the curb and, take us out. I mean, imagine that. And because that's the type of story I see in the news all the time. And so it feels like that could happen to me. And also I'd had in my own personal life, this was in 2014, a really rough year where I'd had a very difficult birth of my second child where we both nearly died. 5 weeks later, the baby got viral meningitis and we were back in hospital. Then my eldest child, his daycare called us in to say, look, something's wrong here. His hands have a tremor in them. You need to investigate that. And then that sparked, years of medical issues with him. And then, over the sort of ensuing months and years, my 20-year marriage broke down. And so I had this period in my personal life where I felt like all my luck had run out, that I'd used up my lifetime's worth of luck and then everything was going wrong. And I felt like, as a lot of people do when things go wrong in your life, why is this happening to me? Like, I'm a good person. Why is all of this, all of a sudden, these terrible things are happening? And because I had seen it over and over again on my TV show, I felt like what I'm scared of is now happening to me, and how do I come to terms with that? And so I thought what I wanted to do was look at how people, the news is like all these frozen moments of time where you just see the worst day of people's life and then you never really, sometimes you hear about them again, but you often don't. And so I thought, well, I want to go and talk to people and ask the sort of questions that often don't get asked because you feel socially awkward. And I just want to basically find out when the worst thing that you've thought of actually happens to you, what happens next? Is your life destroyed? What happens after that? And so that's the quest that I embarked on, very fearful at the start of it.
You start the book with the day you gave birth to your second son, James. Did that start as an ordinary day, or looking back, did you have some sense of foreboding?
That is such an interesting question. I didn't really have any sense of foreboding. I remember I had a regular appointment at the obstetrician, and then I met my friend Monica Attard for a coffee, and it was a really hot day, and Monica said, I'll drive you home. And I was like, no, I want to walk. It's not that far, I'll walk. Anyway, I walked in very, very hot weather, which had nothing to do with what eventually happened. But of course, later on, what happens is when something awful happens to you, you look back to go, were there any signs? Should I have read the signs? The only sign was that I had had a sort of pain in the upper left side of my abdomen, sort of right where your ribs finish, and it just felt tender all the time. I was always rubbing it. And it turned out later that was a sort of pressure point where, I can't explain it nicely, basically my uterus burst and the baby came out and went into my stomach cavity and caused, I was in hospital at the time when it happened because I'd woken up in the middle of the night and that pain was quite a bit worse, and I just felt like, I feel sick. And I threw up, and I knew it wasn't labour pain. And so I said to my then husband, we better go to the hospital. And we got there and everyone was like not really sure what was going on, and they thought maybe it's appendicitis or something. And then some ultrasound technicians came. This was by now, first thing in the morning. And they had a look, and I could see their faces just looked like horrified. And I said, what can you see? And they said, we can't see anything. There's like a dark substance blocking the view. And I assumed, that must be blood. And so then fairly rapidly, my obstetrician came in and he said, look, we don't know what's going on, to be completely honest with you, but I just think it'd be better. I was about 37 weeks pregnant. I think we should just take you into theatre. We'll do a general anaesthetic, just open you up, get the baby out, then we can see what's going on, and then if you give me permission, I'll just do whatever's required. And I said, yeah, sure. And he said, I'm sorry, but we're gonna have to cut vertically up so we have full access. I said, yep, whatever. And then he left the room to go and scrub up, and then within like a minute, I was floored by this like just gobsmacking pain, and just felt like my ribs were cracking one after the other. I felt like I couldn't even breathe. And then the midwife said, I had like a baby monitor around my stomach. She said, I've lost the baby's heartbeat. She hit a button on the wall. And then it was like, to me, it looked like pandemonium. Like people just came running. Yeah. And some orderlies lifted me onto a, thing that rolled me down the corridor. And it was completely terrifying, and also just I was in so much physical pain. And then we got into the theatre, and I remember seeing, like, the last thing I saw was someone with a felt pen, like, drawing a line up my stomach where they're about to cut. That's how fast it was moving. And I just had no idea what was going on. And I remember as we were running down the corridor, somebody, I later discovered it was the midwife, reached under the sheet and held my hand as we were running down. And it was amazing how comforting that was, like that someone acknowledged that, like, there's a person in the centre of this who's terrified. And then the next thing after all of that, then I woke up and I was in a room by myself with just tubes coming out of everywhere and, drips in both hands, and I could feel a tube up my nose that was running down my throat, and, I was like, what happened? No baby. So I was like, what happened? And my obstetrician came in and he said, look, you've had, this uterine rupture, you've lost a huge amount of blood, you've had 3 transfusions in surgery, all your organs were all covered in blood. It sounded basically like they'd had to just hose me
you out.
Yeah.
Get the gurney.
Yeah. And so then they were like, what we're worried about now is because are all your other organs going to work okay? Or is, their blood clots stuck on them that we haven't got off? And, is your bowel going to be blocked up? Like, what's going to happen here? So I was nil by mouth. I had a nasal gastric tube pumping out the contents of my stomach so that nothing would go through my system, so they could just rest and see what happened. And then the baby was in the neonatal intensive care unit because he had lost oxygen. And so they were not sure what the situation was going to be with him. And so, unlike most people, when you have a baby, I didn't even see my baby. Like, there was moments where I thought, did the baby actually die? No one wants to tell me because I am really unwell here and they think it's going to stress me or whatever. So, it was a couple of days, and then I just broke down crying, like, hysterically. And the nurses sort of took pity on me and ended up wheeling my whole bed and all my bags and tubes and trolleys and things, stands, down to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, where the baby was hooked up to, like, a ton of different things as well. And then he the first photo of us, he's just lying on my bed next to me. You basically can barely see him because he's got so much gear on. And I just look genuinely unrecognisable. And
it's the saddest photo.
Oh, it's shocking. And then there's another photo of us, like, only 2 days later, where he basically looks normal. He's got nothing on him then, and I look much better, but still look not great.
Incomplete shock,
like just shell-shocked and just weak from the blood loss.
Because your first delivery was pretty normal.
Normal, yeah.
It's
normal delivery.
2014.
Yeah.
You're not trying to give birth in a field or in a dolphin pool, like in your lounge room, like you have.
Had I not had the good luck to be in hospital when that happened, if I'd been at work coming off air from 7:30, we would have both died. Like, it was just, and it was shocking to me because I sort of thought later, I didn't even think that we would have any maternal morbidity in Australia. Like, I didn't know anyone would die in childbirth. And so I Googled it, and it's very rare for women to die in childbirth, but it can still happen.
Yeah, it can.
That was sort of shocking to me. You more tend to think about things, and I've had friends where things have gone wrong with the baby.
Exactly.
At 5 months or at full term or a few days later or whatever. So I didn't realise that actually, no, as a woman, like, it is a dangerous thing to give birth.
So you decided that you were going to lean into this at a certain point. You decided that, because I was going to ask you, when you're in 7:30 and you're throwing to those stories that will often move me to tears, and then it comes back and you've got to maybe introduce the next segment, or you've got to interview the Prime Minister or whatever it happens to be. How do you get through each night? Like, what are your self-protective mechanisms for managing that?
I ask for a briefing on if there's a story that's emotional, or if there's a story that I think, because if there's a point of connection that we relate to, we all it affects us more. So if it's, something about little children or whatever, I will ask for a briefing, or a woman about my age who's had something terrible happen. Sometimes if I know it's going to be really hard going, I'll ask for the volume to be turned down so I don't have to hear it go live to air, or I'll watch the story before we go to air so that the sort of initial emotional impact of it is blunted. But, look, every now and again I'll think, oh, man, I'm in real trouble here. Like, I just can't hold it together. And usually I'll say to Mick, who's my floor manager, who's on the floor of the studio with me, Mick, quick, you need to talk to me. And I try to get Mick to say something to sort of distract me from it. I'll often ask, what is the last shot in the story, so I can brace myself. It's a shot of a child or something like that. So I just do try to take steps to emotionally distance myself from the content while we're live on TV. I don't watch the stories in the same way that I watch them if I were just sitting at home watching the show.
So then you decide to do this book.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm imagining you draw up the most bleak list of all time. What happens next when you decide to do it? How did you decide who to interview?
What happened was at the end of so I had this terrible year in 2014, and at the end of 2014, the Lindt Cafe siege happened, and Philip Hughes, the cricketer, got struck in the head with a cricket ball and died. And it was just... They were quite close together, those stories, within a few weeks of each other. And they were both things that, the type of stories that rattles the whole community, whether you know anyone involved or not. You just feel like, oh man, that's horrendous, and how quickly life can change. Or you think, geez, I could have been at the Lindt Cafe. Like, how do I know the cafe I'm in tomorrow morning this couldn't happen, and so forth. And so those two stories really, just got me... Like, I would lie awake at night thinking, why were those 18 people in the Lindt Cafe? Like, and what about the fact that Katrina Dawson was like, hey, do you want to go downstairs for a hot chocolate? Like, and that was the decision about how long your life's going to live. And like, the idea in my head, I always could visualize, like, she didn't know it, but the little hourglass, the last grains of sand were in it, like that on that morning when she woke up. And I just kept thinking about this stuff, and I wrote a little piece about it, like just 1,000 words on this sort of idea for the Australian newspaper, and it got lots of feedback and stuff. And then I didn't feel like I was finished with it, and I felt for myself really fearful in my own life about what's going to happen to me next. And so I actually started not with the stories of people and what had happened to individual people. I started looking at psychological research about how the human brain deals with blind sides and how we adapt to changing circumstances in our life. Probability, like what are my chances of being in something like a Lindt Cafe type event? And then once I started... it was just almost like a lucky dip of reading, I guess. So I started with all of that. And then I almost worked backwards to find people. So, for example, if I was looking at questions of, say, there's one chapter in it which looks heavily at why, when a Lindt Cafe type thing happens, do we immediately all go through a process of thinking that could have been me, and what would I do if that was me? Like, why does our brain do that? And so then it felt to me like, because the Lindt Cafe had sparked that, I wanted somebody who'd been in the Lindt Cafe. And because I was looking at probability, I felt like, okay, I want somebody who there's even more of a statistical sort of issue. And so the person I ended up interviewing is a woman called Louisa Hope, who was one of the Lindt Cafe victims, but she also had multiple sclerosis. So I kept thinking, oh God, wouldn't you be just so filthy? Like, I've got MS, and as if that's not bad enough luck for my life, now I've got to be a hostage in a terrorist drama?
Yeah.
And so I spoke to her because I wanted to know, well, how do you come to terms with when life's given you? Like, the odds of that is something like 1 in 1.3 billion. I got the Bureau of Statistics to help me crunch it. It's so unlikely that you would have both of those things happen in your life. And I wanted her to help me explain, how do you not just curl up in a ball and become bitter and furious at that sort of stuff? How do you actually deal with it? So I guess I sort of went backwards in some ways to find some of the people from the research. But I also, because I've been a journalist since the early 90s, there were certain stories that had really stuck in my consciousness that I had not been able to forget because I was so shocked by what had happened to the people in it. So, one of the biggest stories of my career in journalism is the Port Arthur massacre. And people might remember there was a man, Walter Mikac, whose wife, Nanette, and he had 2 little girls, Alana and Madeline. They were trying to get away from Port Arthur, and Martin Bryant was in a car, and he pulled over and he shot all 3 of them. And so Walter Mikac became, at that time, in 1997, like the most famous person in Australia for the worst possible thing that could happen to you. And I thought, well, I wonder what Walter's life is like 20 years later. Stuart Diver was another person that I thought of who the Thredbo landslide, he was the sole survivor of the 18 people at Thredbo. His second wife had then died of breast cancer. His first wife died at Thredbo, second wife died of breast cancer. Like, how do you keep, like, living and having relationships and that when that's the message life is sending to you? There was another big story when I was a really young reporter, James Scott, who was a medical student who got lost in the Himalayas.
The Iceman.
The Iceman. The Mars bar guy. He was in the middle of this massive media frenzy because he had this improbable survival tale. What was the lasting effect of that on his life? And then there was other people who their stories might be familiar to readers because you might think, oh, yeah, I saw that in the news, but the names might not be familiar. I just sort of I just went to stories that I felt firstly like could illustrate a broader point, but also, to be completely honest, that I felt like, even though they were really sad, that I could handle. Because I do wonder if on some level there were stories that I felt like, you know what, even though I'm trying to stare this in the face, there are some things that I just am too scared to look at. So, for example, Bruce and Denise Morecambe, very famous. They had one of the worst things I could ever think of happening. Your child goes missing. You don't know what's happened for years and years. Bruce and Denise would have tons of wisdom to share about this sort of thing, but I just felt like, you know what, I actually don't think I can sit down with the Morecambes because my own fear of that happening to me is so huge that that was one thing that I felt like I can't go deeply into that.
Did anyone say no to you?
No, everybody said yes. And one of the things that was really interesting was that I think a lot of these people, these momentous things had happened where they wake up, they're living a normal day, and then something shocking happens. And then their friends and family often, seem to split. There's the people who seem to know the right thing to do and say and be helpful and comforting, and there's people who just can't handle the reality of it and they fall by the wayside. And Walter Mikak actually described it as it's just loss added to your existing loss, because people that you thought were your friends, then they're not there for you and you feel like, oh, now I've just lost something more. He made the point as well that you feel like people often feel like, well, I didn't know what to say. Like, what could I say to Walter? His whole family had been killed. And Walter would say, well, does anyone really think there's anything they could say that could be worse than what just happened to me? There's nothing you could say that could make that any worse.
Walter told you a story that I found just heartbreaking about a friend of his called Doug.
Yeah, so Walter was a few weeks after what had happened, was walking down the street in the town that they lived in near Port Arthur, and he had this really good friend, Doug, who he used to play golf with every week, and Doug's daughter worked in Walter's pharmacy. And Walter hadn't heard, really from Doug, and he's walking down the street, he sees Doug walking towards him, and they meet eyes, and Doug just turns around and starts walking briskly the other way. And Walter thought, wow, this is it. If I don't go after Doug now, I'm never going to speak to Doug ever again. And so Walter started going after him. And then Doug picked up pace. And then Walter picked up pace. And then Doug starts running. And Walter starts running to catch up with him. And finally Walter catches him and he puts his hand on his shoulder and turns him around. And Doug's just got like tears streaming down his face. And Walter says, it's okay. Like, you can talk to me. It's okay. And it really, I totally can understand why Doug would do that, because it's so, 20 years later, I was scared to meet Walter and talk to Walter. Like, I can completely understand why Doug would do that. I think that's, for all of us, there's an instinct to do that. But I also felt sorry for Walter to think, oh man, the burden that Walter had, and he had to be the person to be on the front foot. Michael Spence, the Vice-Chancellor of Sydney Uni, is another person in this book who I interviewed because he lost his wife really suddenly to cancer. She was diagnosed in early December and died in late December. And he said that after she died, and they had 5 children, the littlest one was 4, people, their friends and his colleagues, everyone was just gutted and shocked by it. He realised when he went back to work that he would have to be the person to make everything okay and to diffuse the awkwardness. So he would start meetings by saying, I just want to thank everyone for all your lovely, kind messages about Beth and blah, blah, blah. And I said to him, didn't that seem like, are you kidding me? Like, everything I've been through, I'm the one who's got to make it all right. And he just said, yeah, but that's just the reality of what it is. And people don't know what to say. And you have to, he gave the example of one of his daughter's friends who came up, young boy, teenager named Rupert, came up and said, Dr. Spence, I was really sorry to hear about Mrs. Spence. And he said, oh, thanks, Rupert, that's really nice of you. You know, I hope you're all, how are you going? And Mr. Spence said, oh, we're doing it pretty tough. And Rupert said, well, look, there's probably nothing that I can do to help, but just let me know if I can. And Michael Spence said, okay, thanks very much. And he said when the boy walked away, he just thought, God, I just wish everyone was taught to just say that. Like, so simple and basic. But it just acknowledges what's happened to you, because a lot of these people, I think, felt like people hadn't really acknowledged. They just wanted it gone away. And so to get back to your original question, sorry, I've really gone a long way around. Everyone said yes, and I felt like when I sat down with them, they were dying to talk about what had happened and what they'd learnt, because no one had asked it. And even, I asked some very personal questions, which I would only do because I felt like the person, wanted to be as honest as possible. So say again, to use the example of Walter, I remember thinking at the time when that happened, like, God, what would keep you going? Like, why would you just not want to kill yourself?
Yeah.
And Walter in the interview said, because he was a pharmacist, sometimes people would see his car at the pharmacy, and he said, he didn't use as many words as this, but he basically said they would be speculating, is Walter going to kill himself, in the pharmacy? And so I felt like Walter had opened the door. So I said, look, nobody has more knowledge and more means than a pharmacist. Why didn't you? And Walter said, look, really, it was partly for my parents and my brothers, because I felt like they had also been through something terrible, and it was their grandkids and all the rest of it. And then he said, I just could never extinguish this just faint, even though I was in so much pain, this just faint glimmer of hope that tomorrow things might get a bit better. I felt like after the court case was over and, my brothers and I were going to go on a holiday overseas, I just felt like maybe things will get a little bit better. And he said I could never quite extinguish that hope. And so I never, he said things got really bad. And it's not to say I didn't think at times of doing it, but it always felt to me like there was a hope there. And then, now Walter, that you never get over something like that, right? You still have to carry the pain of it. But he said it's more like a surgical wound where you look at it and it's happened to you, but it's not like it's an open wound just gushing blood all the time. And so he lives on the northern coast of New South Wales. He has a pharmacy that he runs with a business partner. He works 1 week on, 1 week off. He goes for a surf every day. He remarried. He had another daughter. Like his life is not, he is not just that guy that people might remember from Port Arthur. His life is much richer than that. That is a part of the life of a man who's had happy parts of his life, sad parts of his life, frustrating parts of his life, all the things that all of us had. He just had also one really, really terrible thing.
All of those things you say about people feeling uncomfortable is so true. I remember when I was at school, 3 of the girls at my school lost their mother. She was violently murdered, Margie Edwards. And I remember the dad came in and spoke to the school, and I'll never forget, he said, please don't be scared of us.
Right.
Please come and talk to us. Please don't be scared of us. And that's always stayed with me. But even though you can know that logically, when you were going to meet these people, Walter Mikac, even that name makes my stomach go in a knot, Stuart Diver, how did you prepare? I read as much as I could, and some of these people had written their own books, years ago, so I read their books. So I felt like I was well prepared. Walter, I was so nervous to meet. I felt like I had basically pre-gamed it like a date. Like I'd pre-prepped my small talk. The world's worst date.
The world's worst date. I had my small talk ready because I really liked gardening, so I had some gardening anecdotes, and I had some, he was from Melbourne, so I thought he probably likes AFL. I'll have a few sporting, things to say. And so, but as soon as he arrived, you do realise immediately, like, he's just a guy. Like, he's just a nice dude who's just come from work, the day at work, and he's going to have some Moreton Bay bugs and I'm going to have a steak. Like, it's not... very rapidly with all of these people, they managed to diffuse my fear of them. And I tried really hard to not show... I hope my face didn't show if I had fear. I tried also really hard with everyone to not cry in front of them, no matter what they were talking about, because I felt like it's their experience and their story. And I didn't want to... I felt like crying would show, I don't know, a level of fear or horror or something. There was only one person in the whole book that I was unable to hold it together in front of, and that was Michael Spence from Sydney Uni. And I think that it was because...
That was the one chapter I had to skip.
Yeah, and do you know why I think it is? This is my theory. I think that the closer someone's experience is, or the more relatable it is, the harder it is to take. And you and I are in our 40s, as Michael's wife was, and we have children.
Yeah.
And so the idea that, you could be just completely healthy, as we also are, and you go to the doctor one day and they're like, oh my God, you've got horrendous cancer, and 3 weeks later you're dead. I mean, that to me was so confronting. And when Michael was talking about it, I mean, Michael is a just really nice person. He's quite softly spoken. He said it so matter-of-factly and so because he said it so starkly, just the sadness of it was just so overwhelming. And I couldn't, oh God, I'm just going to start to cry. And so I started to cry and I said, I'm so sorry. I'm such a sook. I'm really sorry, because he wasn't crying. And he said, it's fine. And then I sort of got it back together and we kept going. Whereas with the others,
could you be more of a reporter?
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to just be a reporter and also as they're talking, trying to observe and, think about things and where are you going next. So I was switched on. But, yeah, Michael's story got me. There was another woman in the book, Hannah Rochelle, who was amazing. And her husband, she was also in her 40s and, again, probably relatable to me, had 2 children of about the same age as mine. Her husband went for a surf one morning and, he's a really cautious guy and just got in a bad situation and got smacked into some rocks and died. And she got home from writing. She was a writer. She got home from her day of writing and some police were waiting in her house to say, your husband died. And when she was recounting to me because with her, as with all of them, I tried to ask things that I'm curious about but that you would never ask somebody. So when you get home and there's police waiting at your house, like how do they break that news to you? And then what happens? Do they go or do they stay? And do they, what happens next? I just wanted to know, over those hours in minute detail, what happens? And she was amazing and was very happy to share all of that. But there was a bit where she talked about she knew that she wanted to go and see her husband's body at the morgue, and she talked a lot about that. And when she was telling me about that experience, she was just so lovely, and her husband's photo was on their fridge and there was some lovely kids' art and we're sitting at their kitchen table and it was just so sad. And I just thought it took every last bit of – I just wanted to literally collapse on the ground and just cry my eyes out. It just took every bit of strength for me to just sit there and not sort of do that. And I just felt like it would have been self-indulgent. But what I've tried to do in the book – not a regular reporter and a regular piece of journalism, you wouldn't expose your own reaction like that.
Peek behind the curtain.
Yeah. But in this book, I've said, you might think as you read this that I'm asking, clinical questions and I'm how am I holding it together? Well, the fact is, as I'm writing this, tears are just rolling down my face. I'm just so devastated by it.
That's one of the things it's important for people to understand about the book and why ultimately I found it just such a brilliant read is that it's very chatty. It's really chatty and it's funny in parts and it's not sort of, it doesn't feel cataclysmic and it's not even. There are some parts that are emotionally, gut-wrenching, but there are many parts that are just fascinating and just where you just tell stories.
Well, what I hoped was, and the thing that, as I said, I started out writing it really fearful because I was thinking, geez, I've had a few, obviously compared to the blows people have had in this book, my blows are minor, but I've had a bit of a rocky patch. I'm worried by going and immersing in this stuff, I'm just going to drown under the weight of just the terrible things that can happen in life. But actually just the exact opposite happened. Every one of these people, we would speak about really sad things that had happened, but because there was so much honesty and rawness, all of them when I left I felt close to. It felt authentic and intimate and amazing, we'd shared something amazing. And every single person when they left, instead of feeling drained and just down, I felt almost ecstatic and happy and just stunned at what people can adapt to. What human beings can adapt to is unbelievable and more than adapt to. That you can have terrible things happen to you and then it's not the end of every good part of life or every happy part of life. So that for me was I came out of it feeling I'm still scared about, the way life operates and how you don't know what's coming down the pipeline. But I feel like I'll probably be all right. I feel like I'll be able to handle it, because I've seen so much evidence of people handling stuff that they never thought they'd be able to handle. And the other thing was that I feel like it's given me heaps of tools about just being a better friend and knowing now how to act. Like, so now, yeah, sure, if one of my friends' children died or they were diagnosed with cancer, I would be scared. I'd feel terrible. I wouldn't know what to say. But I would just bumble up and say whatever, because it's not about me, it's about them.
You talked about that. You had in the midst of writing this book, one of your friends was diagnosed with terminal cancer.
Yeah, and I like anyone, like you'd go to the hospital and I'd be walking down the corridor, I'd be thinking, oh, what am I going to see? Is it going to be gross? I'd be anxious, and is he going to be upset? Is he going to be crying? Or how am I going to handle it? What am I going to say? And I just would think, there was a priest I interviewed for this book who said you have to accompany, and it really had made a big impact on me, the use of the word accompany. And I thought, well, my friend Mark, I accompanied him to the pub when times were good. I accompanied him at dinner parties. I accompanied him when we laughed our ass off about things. Surely the least I owe someone that I've been friends with for 20 years is to accompany them when they're facing the hardest thing they've ever got to face. And so I just sort of, I'm sure I made a meal out of it at times. I didn't go up to the hospital often enough. I didn't always say or do the right thing.
But you showed up.
I showed up. I just showed up.
Yeah.
And I kept trying to show up. And so I felt like I knew more what to do for him.
That was something that came through in pretty much all of the stories. You leave Hannah Rochelle's story as one of the last that you tell. And what was interesting about that is this idea of post-traumatic growth. Like many people, I assumed that if you go through something catastrophic, you have PTSD. And it turns out that's not necessarily the case.
No, it's actually, I think about 1 in 10 people will get PTSD. This is if you've got a regular life and then one random awful thing happens to you. Obviously, if you're a police officer or a fireman or soldier and you're dealing with traumatic stuff all the time, your susceptibility to PTSD is much higher. But for the average person who you happen to be on a bus that hits somebody and they die, you probably won't get PTSD. That's not to say you won't feel traumatised and rattled, but it won't probably turn into a full-blown, post-traumatic stress situation. The thing is that the human brain, what it immediately tries to do is process what has happened to you. And so it generally does that by there's three ways. One is denial, because it's too big to handle. And denial is actually a quite handy short-term coping mechanism.
Because it insulates us from the shock, doesn't it?
That's right, yep. So denial is trickier long-term, but in the short-term, denial is actually sort of handy. And then the other two ways are either accommodation or assimilation. So you either, when you think, why did this happen to me, you either accommodate it into your existing worldview. So you think, well, I've always thought, good things happen to good people. The evidence here is that that's not the case, but, I think blah, blah, blah. And you find a way to rationalise it so you end up still believing good things happen to good people. Or you say the other way of doing it, assimilation, is you change your fundamental beliefs. So you go, actually, no, bad things happen to good people, and that's what I believe now. And so you change your beliefs. So you either accommodate and you make what's happened fit what you believe, or you change your core beliefs. And so the brain, how rapidly the brain is able to do that correlates with how well you cope to your changed circumstances. One of the really interesting studies that I came across is to do with the question of why me. Like, there's dozens and dozens of studies where people have looked at everyone, when something awful happens to them, the first thing they go is, why me? Why did this happen to me? And that is the brain's first step in attempting to process what's happened. And this study looked at people in a spinal rehab unit in Chicago, and it was people who'd become either paraplegics or quadriplegics due to accidents. And so there were, car accidents, there was a diving accident, someone had been hit by a falling piece of farm machinery, there were some shootings and so forth. So I think there was 25 to 30 people, and they studied them over a year, and they looked at how they'd answered the why me question and how well that correlated with coping. And what they found broadly was that any answer is better than no answer. So even if your answer seems crazy, like because the devil got into God and made God do it, that allows your brain to then go, okay, put it in the filing cabinet, and now...
so you can file it under something, under D for devil.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so your brain moves it out of the active memory, which is where it's ruminating on it all the time, and it puts it somewhere. You go, okay, well, the devil made God do it right now. What am I dealing with now? There were certain things that made the process of getting it out of your active memory harder. So one of the things I found fascinating was for people who had been injured doing something that they always did. So say if you always drove to work and you had been, or you always worked on a farm and you were injured in some farm machinery, you were more likely to say, well, I guess I was always in the car. It was a matter of time.
It was bound to happen.
Yeah, it was bound to happen. And so that, your brain could go, okay, this happened to me because it was bound to happen, or it was bound to happen to somebody, it happened to me. Brain files it away and you move on, or you start to move on. One of the things that correlated with poor coping was if the person had been injured doing something that was a break in their regular routine. So say if you normally got the train to work, on this particular day someone offered you a lift and you accepted, and then you were fatally injured. It was harder for the brain to let go of the idea, why did I change my routine? If only I'd done what I always did, this wouldn't have happened. And so those people found it harder to adapt. And there's lots of other things that correlate with adaptation too that are out of your control. Personality traits count for about 50%. So if you gender, women, because women talk more about things, and so that helps you process more. If you're an optimistic person, you're more likely to find a way to view something positive from it. So there's tons of different, factors that come into it. But it's incredible how predictable the human brain is in how it acts. Even, for example, I was looking at how we alter our behaviour after something happens, like, say, the Dreamworld roller coaster tragedy. So I remember on that day thinking, oh, man, that is just it was so horrifying to me. And again, for me, it had a point of relatability because I could potentially be at Dreamworld because I have small children. And I thought, well, I don't think I'm going to let the boys go on roller coasters anymore because I imagine that. I just couldn't handle it. Now, I made this calculation as they were sitting in the back seat of my car and I was driving them home from daycare. The chance of us being in a fatal car accident or a catastrophic car accident is exponentially greater than the chance of them being injured if they ever go on a roller coaster. And so, I'm making basically an illogical decision, and I'm making the decision based on a present day decision based on what I might regret in the future. So I'm saying, well, I'm not going to let them go on roller coasters in case this happens in the future. Well, then I discovered in the course of my research that is actually a mathematical theory called minimax regret, which is making a decision based on the concept of future regret. And I just thought, oh my God, like that to me seems like such a weird, crazy way of thinking. And yet it's so common that there's a full mathematical branch dedicated to the study of it.
Yeah, right. So what you were thinking was completely common.
Completely common, yeah. So all of these sorts of ways of thinking, even say things like, how after a Lindt Cafe thing, people will go, well, I was meant to be at the Lindt Cafe, or I was at the Lindt Cafe just an hour earlier. And it's like they're sort of saying...
There, but for the grace of God go I.
Yeah, or, that must have happened for a reason. I was meant to not be there, or the universe or God or whatever was looking after me. That is, again, all to do with the way the human brain works, where we think of ourselves as being sort of uniquely significant. Because you take that thinking through, you think, right, so you weren't meant to be there, but what, the other 18 people were meant to be there? Like what, Katrina Dawson was meant to be, killed by some deranged dude because she wanted to have a hot chocolate with her friend. So there's so many little quirks of our brain that are just actually completely scientifically understandable in the way we think, which I also sort of found comforting because I felt like, okay, so I'm not just some strange, irrational person. I think like every human being.
You're just a sheep.
Just a sheep, yeah, exactly.
There are two stories in the book, two people you meet with, Juliet Darling and Stuart Diver, both of whom suffered massively well-known tragedies. Juliet Darling lost her partner when he was murdered by his schizophrenic son, Anthony Waterlow. And then Stuart Diver, obviously, the Thredbo landslide. Now, you talk about your magical thinking and the fact that they both then went on to lose someone else that they loved within a few years. How when you heard about that, Juliet lost her son and Stuart Diver lost his second wife. It's true. You think, But that's not fair. They've had their big one thing.
Yeah, totally. And I realised in the process of writing this book how much unconsciously I'd thought that as well about my own life. Like, oh, okay, well, that's my one thing now, so that's what I've got. But actually, that is not how life works. So, Juliet Darling, her partner's murdered, and then a few years later, her 26-year-old son dies, through some heart defect, just some random thing that no one knew he had. Stuart Diver, I actually went to the Bureau of Statistics to get them to help me with something on Stuart Diver, because Stuart said something that pretty much as soon as we sat down to talk, and I found it so moving and I felt so sad for him, and I just felt like I just want to help him not think that. He said, nobody says this to my face, but I know everyone says it behind my back. They all say, geez, who'd sign up to be the third Mrs. Diver? And he said, I think that myself, like who would sign up for all of this? And I went away and I thought, and people have actually said this to me, like, oh, Stuart Diver must be jinxed. Yeah. And I rang up the Australian Bureau of Statistics and said, okay, this is going to be the craziest request ever, but I want you to help me prove that Stuart Diver is not jinxed. I want us to crunch the numbers on what are the odds of this, what's happened to him actually happening to somebody, and also what is the probability that he could lose a third wife. And so this guy, Michael Wilson, was fantastic. He said, okay, send me through, what you need. And so we sort of crunched it all. So we looked at what were the odds of him, being in the Thredbo landslide or of somebody dying in the Thredbo landslide. So basically Stuart's first wife, Sally Diver, died from something unbelievably rare. Nobody could possibly blame Stuart Diver for that, right? It was a freak accident and it was unbelievably unlucky. His second wife, unfortunately, died of something really common, breast cancer. Heaps of women in that age bracket die of breast cancer. So Stuart had the misfortune of having one very, very rare thing happen to him, backed up by one very, very common thing. Neither of those things have any actual link to Stuart Diver. So the chance then, say, for the third Mrs. Diver of looking at, okay, well, what are her odds of dying before Stuart Diver? What are his odds of being widowed again? Well, actually, she might have, we've sort of established that if you've had one bad thing happen to you, it doesn't protect you from another bad thing. But neither does it make you more susceptible to another bad thing either. These things are just their own discrete random events. So the fact that he's lost two wives does not in and of itself make him more likely to lose a third wife. Then you have a look at, all right, the third Mrs. Diver, he's operations manager at Thredbo. Okay, so they'll go skiing a lot. So she might have an elevated risk of a skiing accident compared to the average woman. Stuart likes travel, so they might have an elevated risk of a car accident, a plane crash, something like that. What she doesn't have is an elevated risk of dying simply because of her proximity to Stuart Diver. And in fact, the next person most likely to die in the Diver household is Stuart Diver, because in Australia, women tend to outlive men. So on the straight probability and statistics, Stuart Diver is the most likely person to die in that house. Now, that is not to say Stuart Diver definitely won't lose his third wife. He might, because as we've established, terrible stuff happens. But actually, chances are Stuart will, if he gets remarried, he'll have a happy, life for a long time with his new wife, or he'll die first. Anyway, I rang Stuart.
He should definitely put that on a Bumble profile.
I sent it to Stuart and said, because everyone in the book, I sent them their chapter because I wanted them to not, have anything out there that was wrong or that they felt upset them because they've had so many upsetting things. Anyway, Stuart sort of came back and went, oh, that's great. I should take it down the pub. I sort of felt like poor Stuart. I'm like, hey, Stuart, I've got some great news. Guess what? You're going to die next.
And I loved how you talked about driving away and feeling so affected after that interview, but also subconsciously making a list of your single girlfriends. Yeah, I was
thinking, because Stuart's, he's a lovely guy. He's very handsome. I was thinking, oh, well, God, I've known plenty of single women who'd probably love to hook up with Stuart Diver.
What did he tell you about the difference in losing Sally, his first wife, so tragically and so suddenly and unexpectedly and in his arms, essentially, compared to with Rosanna, his second wife? They knew for quite some time, they had a little girl together, and the preparation that they did for her death. How did he handle those two things differently?
Well, he said, and I mean, it's a very unique position to be in, to be able to compare like sudden, dealing with sudden death to dealing with death that you have notice for. He said there was no comparison and that it was a far better experience with Rosanna. But when I say better experience, it's not a good experience, right? But he said that the difficult thing with Rosanna, he said it was unbelievably painful, and he said they had to basically, in order to deal with it, they had to look it square in the face and not be engaging in all the language of, we just got to fight it to the end, honey, da-da-da. They had to be realistic and go, no, you're going to die. Like, we're at the end of the road with our options. It's palliative care. And they had to actually just deal with it head on and talk about their daughter Alessia. What are we going to put in place for Alessia so she has memories of you, and what are we going to do so that her memories of you are positive and it's not all tied around mum being ill and
what
dying.
Are some of the things that they did?
They did a book of all of Rosanna's favourite recipes for Alessia. She had birthday presents ready for her up until age 18. They do even things, Stuart talked about this thing about locking away positive memories. So he said, for example, he had a cork from a bottle of Grange where they'd had a lovely dinner out, and he said, if I'm feeling, really down, I look at the cork. And so instead of thinking about, Rosanna's last days, I'm thinking about an awesome night we had where we had a lot of laughs and it was really fun and amazing. And so I try to focus on that kind of stuff. So he said, having been able to work through that with the person and say what you wanted to say was a much better way of dealing with death than the sudden blindside and just being completely shocked by it. And the priest that I met, Steve Sin, said the same thing. He said, in his experience, because his job all the time is I met him because he helped Juliet Darling. He deals with people who are in shock because their loved one just died, or he goes with them to the morgue, or he goes with them to the funeral home, or whatever has to be done. And he said, too much are we sweeping death under the carpet, and we don't want to see the body. We don't want to sit with someone that we've loved who's died. We don't want to sit with someone who is dying. We don't want to think about it. It's too confronting. And he said that makes the grieving harder, and also that it's just not the right thing to do for the person who's either died or is dying. You have to accept that dying is part of life and living. And so once you accept that, then, you need to just sort of be there. So this was where he talked about accompanying, like you have to accompany the person and just be with them. And he said he finds it, he also changed my thinking about, for example, whether I would want to see the body of, say, my parents or my brother or somebody if they died, because I would have, previous to writing this book, said no, I would never want to have to do that. Whereas now I actually, having read the research and having talked to him, think that I would want to do that, because I feel like it would sort of close the circle and be an opportunity to say goodbye. And also that I know from the research that it does help people accept the reality that someone has died, particularly if it's a sudden death. Actually seeing the person helps you accept that it's happened, because the human brain will do all sorts of crazy things to try to avoid accepting that somebody has died. So, for example, a police officer that I met who was with the homicide squad said to me, when you go and see somebody and knock on the front door to say, your son's been shot or your husband's been in a car accident, or, well, he was homicide, so it would have been not a car accident, but he said you have to be utterly direct. If you say, I'm really sorry, your son's been in a fatal shooting, the person will probably say, is he all right? Or, well, who died? You have to say, there's been a fatal shooting, your son is dead. You have to say it that bluntly, because otherwise the brain, even Hannah Rochelle said when the police were in her lounge room and, they've told her your husband's died, she said after a while, but you said that, the body was at Tamarama, like that. But my husband said he was going surfing at Maroubra. Like, you must have the wrong person. And like she said, you're just casting around constantly for ways that this did not actually happen. You're just grasping for anything you can find. So actually seeing somebody, I mean, you can't dodge that.
Some of the most riveting passages in the book are the parts that happen in the morgue and around viewings. You went and spoke to a forensic counsellor.
Yeah, and I was scared to do it. She was the woman, so Hannah Rochelle and a few of the people in the book said this, that they felt like when they this thing had happened to them, it's like they got plonked in a foreign land where they just no one spoke the language and they didn't know what to do. And Hannah said, when I went to the morgue to identify Matt's body or to see Matt's body, I met this woman and she was the first person I met that I felt like was comforting and actually sort of understood the terrain. And so I went and tracked that woman down. Her name's Wendy Liu and she works at the morgue. And that is her job every day, is to meet people and usher them through this. And she was the most incredible person. She was about our age as well. And so, I mean, I just had so many questions for her around, all of this stuff. Like, do people react the same way when they come in? If the death is anticipated, like, say, a suicide, is that, and a suicide of someone who's had mental health issues, is that easier to handle than a sudden death? And she basically said no, like, there's just the full range of people react in all sorts of different ways. But yeah, she was just absolutely incredible in terms of her ability to explain she had seen every possible way you could die every single day. And she said the effect on her was that it made her so conscious of the value of living and of life. And I asked her if she was fearful, and she said, and I asked, how can you be around this all the time? And she said, because she felt like for the people, when she was seeing them, that even if they'd had terrible suffering, it was over. And so she took comfort in that for them, that it was over. And she took a lot of comfort that she felt like she had the capability and the capacity to help people in these moments. And she knows that not everyone does have that ability. And she felt like, I can do this job and I can be useful and make a difference, and so therefore I want to do that. So yeah, she was amazing.
When people are the victims of violent crimes, it can be particularly difficult. And you spoke to Juliet Darling, whose partner was murdered by his son, and how she gave some testimony, I think, was it the coronial inquest into the death?
She gave a speech at, I forget what it was, some sort of conference, and it made such an impact. It's now quoted in the Australasian Coroner's Manual for like best practice, because she was having these episodes where she would imagine what had happened, and she was having bad dreams all the time, and she just couldn't. It was like this intrusive thought constantly, and about her partner's final moments. And so she ended up, I think, a year or two after the murder.
I had those, and he wasn't my partner.
Oh.
That was such again, what you say about it. I had friends who were friends with Chloe, who was Nick Waterlow's daughter, who was also murdered, and her children were also injured. And there was something so vivid about that. I can't imagine what it was like for her as a partner.
Oh,
and
awful.
she kept playing it through and through her head.
Kept playing it through and through. And so then she felt like she was just going crazy, and she thought, I think I need to see the crime scene photos to try to like stop this imaginary scenario. And so she went back to them. They were held at the morgue. She went back to the morgue or to the coroner's court, and she met a woman there who talked her through them. And what the best practice for this kind of stuff is, and also when you go to see somebody's body at the morgue, that you don't just walk in. Wendy Lou, or this woman's name is Jane Mal, will sit down with you and say, okay, Mia, you're going to walk into the room. It's divided in two. There's going to be, Bob's going to be lying on a bed, and he's going to be under a green sheet. His arm's going to be out. And they will describe in the most minute detail. His head's been shaved because he's had, a head injury or whatever. He has a gash on his right cheek, and they will just describe it so that for some reason helps neutralise the effect of it when you actually see it. And so in Juliet Darling's case with the crime scene photos, Jane Mal said, okay, now it's going to be a photo of a watch on the ground and there's blood on it, and so she'd see that. Now it's a photo of Nick lying on the ground, his eyes are open, and so she would talk her through it so that when you could sort of brace yourself, then you knew what was coming, you could see the photo and then adapt. And Juliet said it helped her gigantically, because what she realised when she saw the crime scene photos was, I wasn't there. I didn't know what happened, whereas what her subconscious was doing in the imagined thing was it was making her feel like she was there, and so she was subconsciously thinking, if I was there, why didn't I stop it? Why wasn't I helping? And then when she saw the photos and it was so far off her imagination, she realised, I couldn't have stopped it. Like, I wasn't there. This is not what I imagined. And so she found that to be quite liberating. There's some of the other research I found, which I thought was super interesting, was human beings prefer to know what's coming, even if what's coming is bad. We like the certainty of knowledge, basically. So they did some studies with, I think it was rats or was it mice, where they could push a button and a reward would come down the pipeline. And after one of the sort of tests, the mice could see what the reward was that was going to come if they pushed the button, and then on the other button it was, you didn't know what the reward was going to be. After a while, the rats would prefer to know the reward. They wanted a known reward, not an unknown reward. There was some other research as well around human beings in this case, where you could have a button that would give you a guaranteed electric shock, or you could have a button that might or might not give you an electric shock. and the humans showed preference for the
Yes.
known electric shock.
Yeah.
Because you could go, all right, I'm going to push this button and I'm going to get a
And I
little
know
zap.
it's going to happen. I can brace myself for it.
Yeah, they didn't like the not knowing if they were getting one or not.
And that's essentially what your whole book is about. You
Yeah.
know, the idea of an ordinary day. You don't wake up thinking, oh, a really terrible thing's going to happen to me today.
Yeah, that's right. And so you can't, a lot of these experiences that I've written about were not things people could brace for because they didn't see them coming. Yeah.
I just want to finally ask you about closure, because it's such an awful word in many ways. What did the people that you spoke to teach you about recovery or closure? What did they have to say about that?
That was really interesting because every person that I met who is a professional in this field, the police officer, I had a magistrate who used to be the New South Wales State Coroner, Wendy Liu, who worked in the morgue, all of these people all hate the word closure. They say there is never closure. You can't neatly tie off these kind of experiences and then you've dealt with it. It's always part of your life. There's no such thing as closure. It's quite insulting. All you can do basically is just adapt and carry on. And so, that was the thing with then I think, anecdotally with all of the people that I'd met who had had these experiences, it doesn't go away. The pain maybe is not as gushing as what it initially is, but it's still there. And if you think about it, you still feel the pain. It's not like you can ever actually close it off and move completely on. You just carry it with you and you dust yourself off and you get back up and you just keep chugging along and you just, hope for the best, basically. So that was the sort of the less, I guess, the thing I took out of it was basically, as I said earlier, that I'm stunned at what people can adapt to and just keep moving on from. And I think for most of us, we're just far more resilient than we have got any idea of. And you don't really know until you're tested. But it gave me a lot of hope that I just think, man, people really can cope with some incredible stuff. And also just from what people said and also from what I've seen in my own life, just the kindness of other people and how much when things are tough for you, how your friends can just rally in such an incredible way for you, just with things that, might seem little, but they make all the difference. I write in the very final pages of the book about how my eldest son, for my little son's second and third birthdays, my eldest son was in hospital on both of those birthdays. And I felt really bad for the little one because it's just crap. Anyway, the second birthday, my friend Ping said, look, I know you can't do it. I'll make a big birthday cake and we'll just get some people around. Just don't worry about it. I'll look after it. And she made this amazing cake, big chocolate cake with bulldozers all over it. It looked like a little construction zone. It was so great. And then the next birthday, the third birthday, I had to be, swapping in and out of overnight at hospital. And so I came home on this Sunday morning and the only time we could really make a birthday party work was 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning. I did nothing. My friend Melanie made the cake. My friend Andrea made all the lolly bags. My friends all showed up with presents for James. We had a regular birthday party, except it was 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And at 9 a.m. he got shunted off with a friend for the day and then I went back to hospital. And, I write in there, in fact, you are named in one of the pages of the book with our friend Caroline, who you guys dropped me off on that particular hospital stay, a ton of meals packaged up to take to hospital every day, and they were all named after sort of ridiculous Trump-related, like Trump's grab 'em by the pussy chicken and stuff like that. And it was the perfect thing because firstly, it's useful and it's something that I wouldn't think about until I got hungry and oh, God, I've got no food and I can't leave here. And so it's just handled. It gives you a laugh because it's just silliness. And also the thing that I've also learnt is you guys just came to the front door and dropped it off. You didn't come in. You didn't say, so what's going on?
Yeah,
how are you? Yeah. You just dropped it and said, here's some food for you. See ya. Off. That is, people often will say, well, let me know if you need anything. Yeah, no, just drop off a lasagna or just, do whatever's required. And so that for me has been amazing to see how kind people are and the things people do to help you out. That's been fantastic. And for all of the people in this book too, I think the experience has been, particularly the people who were very public, like say Walter, the public support, and Stuart as well. I mean, Stuart after Threadbow, he said the grannies knitting him slippers for his feet and just the overwhelming public support is fantastic.
Just a couple of weeks after Leigh and I recorded this interview, her phone rang one ordinary Sunday morning with the worst imaginable news. Her beloved father, the legendary Leigh Sales, who she's chronicled with such love and hilarity for the wry amusement of all her friends on her Facebook page over the years, had had a massive heart attack, and could she fly to Brisbane as soon as possible to say goodbye? This was just weeks before her book about sudden tragedy would be released, and you could not make this shit up. I'm so sorry about the loss of Dale.
Oh, thank you. And it seems, I don't know, like writing a book about blind sides, it feels like almost like I invited something like that to happen to me. But yeah, it's just been a very sad time.
Did the book prepare you?
You know, actually, weirdly enough, it did, because there were certain things that I knew from having written the book that I wanted to do. So, for example, Dad was on life support, and I knew that I needed to be there when he actually died and to be in the room for that, which I did, which I think I might have been scared to do before I wrote this book. And also it helped me a little bit because I've done all this research into how our brains work and how our brains process trauma and grief, and because Dad died suddenly, he had a sudden heart attack, I knew why I was behaving like I was, and I knew why my brain was doing certain things. I was powerless to stop it. Like, you can't stop yourself just because you understand what's happening. You can't stop that sort of stuff, you know, your emotions. But I knew what was happening, and I took some, I guess, solace in the fact that it was just normal to be, like, for example, I couldn't really focus or concentrate on anything. I found it really difficult. I felt like I was not operating at normal capacity, and I know that that's completely normal and that it will come back. So I knew that some of that stuff, that it wasn't my new life, it was just going to be a period. You know, it's losing your parents is one of the expected losses of life, but I think that nonetheless, when it happens, even if you've thought about it, it is really unsettling. It's like just the wool gets, I was going to say the wool, it's like the rug gets pulled out from under you. Like, I felt like, you know, when you see vision of an avalanche and you see the way the sort of snow just sort of like collapses, like a big sort of like cliff of snow will just collapse. That's what it sounded like. It felt like my childhood collapsed like that, even though it didn't, because I still have my memories of my childhood and I'm not a child any longer. My childhood didn't collapse. My childhood's intact, but it felt like that.
Of the people that you interviewed, there were a couple of them who had small children to take care of in the wake of grief. Like them, you didn't have the luxury of just being able to go and get into bed and not get up for 2 weeks. You had to soldier on. You know, James and Daniel are so small. How did you do that? Is it a matter of compartmentalising? How did you get through that bit?
Partly through the help of friends who just stepped in and did stuff, or took the boys, or just helped out, or just made me laugh, or whatever. So, for example, you know, when I said before I wasn't functioning at normal capacity, when I landed in Sydney back from having seen Dad, I thought, oh, the kids, they're going to be coming back home and I have no food in the house. I can't really go now. It's 5 o'clock and they need the bath and bed. I've got no food. And I just sort of was like paralysed in terms of knowing what to do, because your brain doesn't work. So you don't think of things like, oh, I could get online groceries, or I can just, you know, get someone to pick them up. Anyway, Annabelle Crowd picked me up from the airport, and when we got to my house, she just opened her boot and it was full of all the sort of groceries that you would need short term. And you have to, because the children just barrel on. So even I walked into the house and the kids presented me with a shoebox, and when I lifted the lid, they said, look inside. When I lifted the lid, it was one of their favourite toys, this stuffed bunny in there. And they said, Bunny died, this is his coffin. Oh, God. And I just was speechless. And their babysitter said to me, oh, there's been a bit of like game playing like this, and it's fine because it means we're trying to understand. And there was a few things like that happened. The next day, I'd come back from Brisbane because I had to take my eldest son to the hospital because he'd had an operation 2 weeks earlier and we had to go back for a post-surgical thing. And on the way to the hospital, my car broke down. I got a flat tyre. That was how my life has been rolling. Yeah. And when we got out of the car, Daniel said, oh, Granddad would be the best fixer, but he's dead now. And so the kids just say things like that. And I just said, yeah, yep, he would be. And that's right. And just called an Uber and just couldn't believe it. But I just was, but the kids just do stuff like that all the time. And so it fairly wins you when they say things like that. Yeah. But You just have to, like, life just goes on. I couldn't just pull the car to the side of the road and just like lie down in the gutter and scream with like grief and irritation and unfairness. Yeah. I had to get to the hospital. And so I had to just pull over, get out, ring an Uber.
Yeah, get on with it. Do you think that in some ways kids do keep you anchored in the, like, they stop you from descending into the madness of grief because you don't have any choice?
Yeah, they just force you to be doing all of the daily things of life. And, like, there's nothing that has more life than a child, I think, in terms of the way they approach things. They're very present. They're very much in the moment. So, yeah, they were good in terms of making me, do things. But also that was draining. And so I had friends who did really nice things, like on Father's Day, the kids were just out all day. So I could just not have to deal with, because when you're at your limits and the kids are fighting each other or they're screaming at you because you just sat on their invisible bunny or something, you don't have a lot of capacity to deal with stuff like that when you're having a really bad day.
Have you experienced this in phases?
For me, the phases, I think it's much rougher for my brother and my mother because they're in Brisbane, where our family's from, and so you confront it all the time with reminders, whereas I came back to my life in Sydney where Dad's not in it every day, and so it's not such a big, thing in my face. But I think the thing that I've found hard and the phases that come and go are things like you get blindsided all the time by stuff that you're not anticipating because it will remind you of something to do with that person. So there's certain things I've braced for. Like, for example, I thought I would never be able to go to Bunnings ever again because my father is a very handy guy, and often when he came to Sydney we would go to Bunnings because he'd be doing stuff at my house, and so he'd be stalking around grabbing stuff and making friends with everyone there, and I'd be just trailing in his wake. And I just thought I can never go to Bunnings again. Although I did also think, geez, I wouldn't be the first person to cry over their dead father in Bunnings for sure. They'd be like, oh, aisle 29, father recently died, aisle 29. So I did go to Bunnings the other day, but I really braced myself for it because I knew that it would be pretty hard going. And so because I had had a chance to work up to it and brace myself, it wasn't so bad. Whereas on another occasion, I was flying up to Brisbane and I was having quite a good day and everything was pretty normal and I felt completely fine. And then the second that I walked out of Brisbane Airport, I was devastated because I thought Dad is never going to pick me up from the airport ever again. So that, and I didn't see that coming. Yeah. So stuff like that is pretty hard. So it's awful when you just get smacked in the face by something like that that you don't anticipate.
Yeah.
So I've found that sort of rough, just stuff like that. My brother came down to Sydney the other week, and even stuff like this, he just looks and talks and acts like Dad. So that is sort of weird. So there's just lots of little moments like that, I think. So you have sort of just days where you feel completely fine and then just days where you don't feel so good.
Lots of love.
Thank you.
Needless to say, the launch of this book and the promotional tour that Leigh's doing is going to be very, very tough. So if you do go to a book signing or attend any of her events, please be gentle and buy the book. Thanks for listening to No Filter. You can find Leigh's book Any Ordinary Day at any good bookstore or at apple.co/mamamia. It is a fantastic book to buy for yourself, and it is a fantastic book to buy as a gift. And if you're looking for something else to listen to, why not check out my first ever interview with Leigh Sales, where we chat more about her career and her family life. This show was produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on Mamma Mia.